Well, welcome back to Unit 2, International Business with Belhaven University. Hope you've enjoyed reading the material for this week's coverage. And again, I look forward to exploring many of the different concepts here. We're going to be talking about comparative national systems. And as you know from the syllabus, you actually had 2 chapters this week. You're talking about national differences in political, economic, and legal systems. And we're talking about national differences in economic development. So we've got some material to cover, and we'll get through it quite well. And also in this unit, we introduced the first of 3 sessions on our worldview topic. And I've tried to do something a little different with worldview this time. I hope you'll find it interesting. It certainly was to me, excuse me, as I prepared it. So as far as the introduction to this unit, we're going to look at differences in political, economic, and legal systems of various nations. And politically, we can divide them quite simply into more collective versus individual, or collectivist versus individualism systems. In terms of economics, we look at one of 3 types of market systems. We look at market, command, or mixed. And then in terms of our legal systems, we look at common law, we look at civil law, and then we begin to introduce some concepts about theocratic legal systems. And then we're going to spend some time talking about transitioning and transforming economies. Not all economies are at the same place at the same time. Some are in transition and some are in transformation. I've listed 2 really excellent links here. One is the msu.edu Global Insights by Country, and that's a link where you can go and put in just any country in the world, and you can find out so much information about those. And it will tell you about their political, economic, and legal system. And it really supplements the material from our textbook. Again, let me state that our textbook is, in my opinion, the best text in international business on the market today. And it's been around for a long time. It's in the most recent edition. But just because it's a good textbook doesn't mean that it includes everything. And so sometimes you need some supporting material to look at. And this is a good website. And then certainly the Heritage link, heritage.org, is an index of nations. And you can go here and explore that link, and you can look at comparing countries. I think you can compare side by side 2 or 3 different countries, and you get a good viewpoint of where you stand relative to other countries in the world. So I would encourage you to spend some time looking at those. We're going to cover, as I said earlier, comparative economic, political, and legal systems. We're going to look at political economy and the progress of those economies. And we're going to look at those economies that are in transition and those that are transforming. Our unit objectives: we want to understand both national differences in national political systems and differences in national economic systems, and understand the differences in national legal systems. And they all are quite different. There are elements of similarity, but we want to make sure we can differentiate these different political, economic, and legal systems. And then we want to appreciate the challenges associated with bringing those lower performing economies up and making them stable so that they begin to have much better economic, political, and legal systems to deal with. I mentioned that we were going to introduce our biblical foundations, or what we call our worldview. And I've done something a little different here, and I hope you appreciate it, and I hope you gain some good insight here. But we basically have 2 key verses for this course. I've listed several here, but the 2 key ones that we're going to be looking at: Galatians 4:4. Paul is writing to the church in Galatia, and he says, in the fullness of time, basically God enters the world. What does that mean, in the fullness of time? That's a King James version. Other versions have when time was fully ripe, when everything was in good condition, God entered the world. We have Emmanuel, God with us in the form of Jesus Christ. And then, so that's our primary verse. But the secondary verse that I want to use to support that is 2 Corinthians 4:6, in which Paul, writing to the church at Corinth, said that God, he said, who is light and knowledge and power of God in the face of his Son, Jesus Christ. So what does it mean to be light and knowledge of power? And what does that verse have to do with the verse in Galatians of in the fullness of time? In other words, a broad-based question I think we might all ask. Why did God enter the world at the time he did, where he did? Why wouldn't it make more sense to come today to New York with the internet and with all the types of infrastructure that we have that would propagate this message of Christianity around the world? Why did he come, when he did, and where he did? What were the conditions there? So what we want to look at, and we have really 3 sessions. We have here in this Unit 2, again we have something in Unit 4, and finally we'll tie it all together in Unit 7. But we want to describe how the Jewish, the Greek, and the Roman cultures converged to produce ideal conditions for what Paul calls the fullness of time that provided for the spread of the Christian movement around the Middle East and the Mediterranean area. Now I use that word movement on purpose here because at the time it was not a church. At the time these people were not called Christians. You might know they were called the Way. They were called different types of things, but they were not was not called the church as we know it today, and people were not called Christians as we refer to that term today. We're talking about the very birth of this movement, so that's why you'll see in some of the writing that I have, it's talking about a movement. So there was a Jewish, a Greek, and a Roman influence in these cultures, and we're going to be spending a lot of time, some in this unit, but also in the next couple of units, talking about this issue of culture, how important culture is. And so as this movement began to spread around the Middle East and particularly the Mediterranean area, what was it that created the environment for this type of growth? And then we want to explain how the existing infrastructure aided the movement and how the diffusion, and diffusion just means the spread, how the spread of Christianity fulfilled Jesus' message to go and make disciples of all nations. So primarily I want you to look at Galatians 4:4 and 2 Corinthians 4:6, but also we're going to talk about Matthew 28:16 through 20. You're familiar with that as the Great Commission, where Jesus meets with his disciples and he tells them that they're going to go first here in Judea and in Samaria and then into uttermost parts of the world. And so we want to look at the background of why and how that all occurred. And then of course Acts 1 through 8 is a furthering of those events following the end of Matthew. So we have the gospel account at the very end of the Gospels, and then we have Acts. And Acts really is more talking about the activity of the apostles as they traveled around and began the formation of this thing we call the church and Christianity. And then we have these 2 pieces of 2 letters that Paul wrote. So Paul is a big player in this type of activity, this movement of spreading the church throughout the Middle East and the Mediterranean area. So I want you to explore the issue of the fullness of time. What does it really mean? And then the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. I want to break this apart and discuss it a little bit. What does it mean to converge? What is light, knowledge, and glory? Well, you know, from the Jews, from the Hebrews, we call that, broadly speaking, Judaism. What did they produce? Well, they produced the Old Testament law, and the law was light. The Jews were a different nation than anyone else. They were God's chosen people. And so from the Jews, we can say that we received light, meaning the world received light. And God told them through Abraham, way back in the Old Testament in Genesis, that they would be a blessing to all nations of the world, or that his seed would be. And so we have light from the Jews. And then the Greeks were a dominant culture at one time. And what did they provide? Well, they provided knowledge. They provided intellectualism. And beyond that, they provided the language, really, of what became the New Testament. It was the Koine Greek. Greek was the trade language that virtually everyone knew, everyone spoke. Certainly business people spoke it. Even probably some of the less educated disciples who were business people had a working knowledge of the Greek language. And we know that the New Testament was written in Koine Greek. And so the Greeks provided a foundation of language, of intellectualism, of the exploration of new ideas, an openness to look at new ideas. And that was necessary for this diffusion or spread of this movement called Christianity. And then the Romans, we all know about the glory of the Holy Roman Empire, or what we call the Pax Romana. There was a general peace in the nations where Rome had conquered and they had settled. And so what happens at this particular time in history is the convergence of these three. So we have light, knowledge, and glory. And how was it manifested? How were those early disciples able to take this new movement, which was not fully developed yet? In fact, the New Testament was in the process of being written. Those letters of Paul to those various churches had not been disseminated broadly at that time. But what were the conditions that were there enabling that to occur? Jesus said in Matthew 28:16-20 and Acts 1:1-8, first, go and make disciples. And he said, you will receive power. And he says, I want you to be witnesses. I want you to go to Jerusalem. That's the starting point. That's where they were. But then I want you to spread out into Judea, to Samaria, it's a little further afield, and to the ends of the earth. How were they able to do this? Well, the first thing, from our worldview perspective, they had the influence of the Holy Spirit, because Jesus had told them, you're going to be witnesses to me after you have this power that comes upon you. So he filled them with the power of the Holy Spirit. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was the influence of the infrastructure of the Roman Empire. Infrastructure is an important concept. It's an important concept today. In the unit that we've just had, Unit 1, we talked about the factors that enabled the globalization of markets, the globalization of production. And one of those factors was technological advancements. And the fact that we have the microprocessor, we have the World Wide Web, we have complete changes in the way we transport goods around the world. And so infrastructure is an important concept. Infrastructure goes much broader than simply roads, bridges, highways, harbors, and airports. Of course, they had no airports during the Roman Empire, but what they did have was the Roman roads. They developed the Roman roads, and everywhere roads went, people traveled. And when people traveled, people took ideas. And when they took the ideas, they had generally willing audiences to listen to their new ideas. So the Jews, Judaism, provided the law. The law was fulfilled in the face of Christ. And so now the disciples have been trained for 3 years, and Jesus sends them out to disseminate, to spread, to disperse this message everywhere they went. How were they able to do that? Well, number one, the Roman Empire provided the basic physical infrastructure for the message to be broadly dispersed. And then the Greeks, with their idea of knowledge, their idea of intellectualism, their idea of wanting to explore any and every new concept, provided really the audience. In other words, we had inquisitive ears. So I think everything was ripe for the message to take shape, and take shape it did. Now, would the disciples have moved out of Jerusalem if they had been comfortable? I think the answer is no. And what happened, they had to be made uncomfortable in order to move out. And so we began to see some persecution of the disciples, and they were afraid, they were losing their homes, they were losing their business interests, they were losing everything. And so they began to move. And everywhere they moved, they took the message with them. And they took the message under the power of the Spirit through using the infrastructure of the Roman Empire and the intellectual activity of the former Greek Empire, which was still prevalent. Elements of the Greek Empire was still prevalent, primarily with language and the idea of study and the desire for knowledge. So I think all of these things came together all at the same time to produce an environment that was rich and ripe for this new movement to be spread. Now, we'll be making some analogies probably in the next units about how ideas and things spread in the world today and what is it that causes it. So I want you to look closely at this keyword infrastructure. Look at it from a physical perspective, but also look at it in today's world from maybe not just, as we mentioned, the roads, the bridges, but look at the way we spread ideas today. Just this particular type of educational delivery system. You're getting this in a non-traditional model. And so I'm here to argue that the spread of this new movement that we came to know as the church and Christianity was spread through some non-traditional, some non-conventional, using some novel means to disseminate the word. So as we go through here, pay attention to these verses, try to make some application to the passages and to the concepts, to some of the things we're studying as far as international business. Because if we look at the church, their church is very international, it's very global, and it reaches everywhere that you can imagine. And we want to look at the church in its different forms today and always keep in mind that we want to have a biblical basis to the way that we understand how the movement started, how it was dispersed, and then what is its form in the world today.